Hello and welcome to the Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast, the podcast series for professionals in the downstream refining, petrochemical and gas processing industries. I'm your host, Callum O'Reilly, and in this episode I am joined by David Wilson, CEO at Exemplar, an analytics company that supports businesses in revolutionising the future of energy through modelling and simulation. We're going to be discussing the role that oil and gas is currently playing in the booming data center industry and what the future holds. So let's talk to David.
The Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast is brought to you by Owens Corning Foam Glass Insulation. From managing vapor drive and mitigating corrosion risk, to maintaining thermal performance and supporting safety on the job site, the insulating system plays a critical role in high-performing hydrocarbon processing facilities. Learn more about how foam glass insulation contributes to the design of high-performing insulating systems at cryogenic facilities at www.owenscorning.com/foamglasslng study. That's www.owenscorning.com/foamglasslng study.
Hi David, welcome to the podcast and thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Hal.
Great. Okay, David. So before we dive into the topic of our podcast today, which is the role of oil and gas in data centers, I thought it would be beneficial if you could introduce yourself to our listeners and perhaps tell us a little bit about the work that Exemplar does.
Thanks. So I'm the CEO of Exemplar. I've actually spent my whole career in energy. I started out designing power plants. I worked upstream oil and gas for Schlumberger for quite a few years. I've touched the refining sector. And then I was serving McKinsey & Company, helping a lot of primarily energy utilities transition or build their outlook for the future. And 8 years ago, I joined Exemplar. And Exemplar provides the largest simulation platform globally, which really gives the ability for companies in the energy sector to look into the future. We serve around 700 organizations in 80 countries, from the oil and gas majors through to the energy system operators, the gas network operators, etc. So it's a very broad set of users, all aimed at understanding a bit more about the future.
Thank you for that introduction, David. So first question from me today, what does the current energy mix around data centers look like? And how does oil and gas factor into the data center energy mix?
It's such a simple question, but a complicated set of answers, because it depends a bit around where you are in the world and which data centers you're talking about particularly. But in general, a large part of the load for data centers comes primarily from gas, less so from oil. I mean, there is an oil presence with a lot of data centers choosing to have a backup capability on site, which is typically covered by oil. But in terms of actual generation mix, oil is a smaller part of the story. So for a lot of data centers, gas is a strong supplier, as well as renewables are an increasing part of the load these days.
So I was interested in something you mentioned there, David, about there being regional differences. So I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more detail about what the differences are between the energy mixes in, say, the United States and in other regions around the world.
Yes, this is always interesting because it depends a bit on the geographic characteristics of the region, plus the historic assets that have been built, and as well as the future aspiration. Seeing how you're in Europe, we'll start with that story. A stronger renewables mix, stronger regulatory settings, and some strong legacy benefits with things like the Nordics having pretty fantastic hydro resources. And also a relatively recent history with the Ukraine crisis and what happened with Russian gas has driven a big focus on the renewable sector into Europe today. So pushed a little bit more that way. And I think one of the big changes in the last couple of years has been the adoption of seaborne LNG. So Europe's become much more connected to the gas systems around the world, if you will, or the gas resources, but a decreasing part of the overall mix. In the US, very strong natural gas resources. In fact, the strongest network in the world, a massive proven set of gas reserves. And so there's a really strong build out around natural gas to support data centers into the future. And the renewable incentives are backing off quite strongly. That said, for data centers and electricity in general, renewables are still the lowest cost new build. So we would expect to see that continue to happen at pace. Permitting headwinds and all of those and speed, occupancy and grid capacity to move that energy sees a strong appetite for co-located gas-fired generation with the data centers. And I think just to give that context, the data centers are enormous, right? And getting the capacity to handle those, and particularly in the US, maybe I'll circle back to that in a second, just finish the regional piece. Asia per se is a little bit more coal dominated. Again, it depends country by country. So Australia is, which I know quite well, as you can tell from my accent, is moving very quickly to a high renewable setting. China is building out more renewables than the rest of the world combined, but is still coal dominated. So if you want to sort of take that regional view, Europe, increasingly renewables with good legacy of renewables, hydro and nuclear. US, still a lot of renewable activity, but natural gas is a huge player in Asia's coal and moving to renewables at the minute. To sort of just bring that into perspective a little bit, we talk about the data centers, and some of them are just phenomenally huge. If we stepped back in time a decade ago, a data center was 20, 30, 40, 50 megawatts, and 50 megawatts was big. Today, state of the art is 1,000 megawatts or a gigawatt, and we've got sites that are moving to be 5+ gigawatts. And how do you put that into perspective? I was down in Texas the other day talking to a developer there who's looking at putting 5 of those large data centers there. That's 20 gigawatts of scale. The Texas grid today is 75 gigawatts, right? So we're talking that third of the grid capacity. So these things are enormous, but they're not uniform, as in they're not just being put everywhere equally across the world. They're quite located typically around several factors, but access to high-speed fiber, proximity to the computing need, talented workforce, and increasingly access to energy, not just to the generation, but also the ability to move it. So transmission, interconnection. And that over the last few years, all those easy sites, those ones sort of sitting there just saying, hey, I've got good access to the grid and there's energy have been consumed. And so people who are looking at new data center sites typically having to solve that problem. They either need to build new transmission or new generation. And that's a complex evaluation, but people are sitting there going, sometimes, a lot of the time, it's easier to build generation on site, co-located with it. And that typically, if that's the decision, is usually some form of gas generation.
So David, you bring me on to my next question. I was going to mention, with such phenomenally large data centers being built at the moment, is oil and gas able to keep up with demand? And will it be able to keep up as data centers continue to grow and expand?
Yeah, and it's an interesting situation because over the last few decades, if you will, and particularly the last few years, electricity demand has been relatively flat. And it's not that hasn't been more electrical things. You can see this move to electric vehicles and electrification of industrial loads, etc. But that's been largely offset by efficiency. So you can think about that in a home context of heat pumps and efficient lighting, and all of these things mean that even though you have more electronic things, you're actually not using more load. But the data centers really changed that. And so if you've been looking at the load forecast in a lot of these regions, they were forecast to be flat or growing a couple of percentage points a year. Data centers really changed that. And they came a bit out of the blue. No one foresaw this even 5 years ago, just how fast this would ramp up. So can the oil and gas industry support the demand? From the supply side, yes. Particularly, there's a very strong set of resources and supply opportunities. I'm sitting here in the US at the minute, and there's plenty of opportunities to meet that demand. And that's true around the world with the seaborne LNG or local resources. So in the medium term, I don't think there's any supply shortage, which is good news.
So if there's not a supply shortage, David, are there any barriers that are currently facing oil and gas in accessing these data center facilities?
I think a slightly different perspective of that is that most of the large data center providers or users are aiming for a net zero future. So it's not necessarily a shortage of fossil fuels, if you will, be that coal-fired generation or the oil and gas side. It's that ability to hit emissions aspirations for these organizations in the talk more on the medium term for that. So there's various different schemes people are using to offset the emissions that they're doing, but ultimately they aspire for a net zero set of technologies, which obviously oil and gas can be part of that mix through companion technologies. It's just getting the economics of all of that to work.
So as you mentioned, David, data centers are pushing for net zero emissions. So I was wondering what role low carbon gas, so for example, renewable natural gas or hydrogen, or perhaps even CCS equipped generation can play.
Yes. And I think there's a role for all of those. Renewable natural gas has some supply constraints around that. So I think that will play a role, but it's limited just because of the ability to put it. CCS is a technology that's been around for quite a while now. It's struggled to scale, and it's struggled to scale really for economics. The cost of adding carbon capture to natural gas plants makes it materially more expensive than renewables typically for electricity generation. So there's a role for it and there's a mix, but it's not a clear economic winner. And so when people are looking at a portfolio of generation, they're looking at that ability to manage the intermittency of renewables and the dispatchability of the gas plant, and then new technologies that are coming up now, not even new, if you will, but battery storage has become very cheap over the last few years, really surprising everyone with how fast the cost out of that has come. So that decision making about how much renewables can you get in, how much battery storage, and then the dispatchability of gas and the ability to build all of those makes that calculus a little more complex than it sounds. And then that question of hydrogen that you asked. So hydrogen's playing a bigger role in Europe, partly driven by the emissions regulations. In the US today, particularly with the changes to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act that's happening under the Trump administration, the future of hydrogen is a little less clear, and we're seeing a lot of those projects slow down. So I think one of the interesting things with this whole space at the minute is that there's dramatic change, not only on the demand side, the technologies are evolving quickly and the regulatory settings are also changing quickly. So that makes the looking into the future and understanding exactly what will happen more complex than we've faced for many years in this sector.
Yeah, David, and I wanted to come back to just something you mentioned at the end of your answer there about the recent legislative changes in the US and the uncertainty that it's caused around renewables. So how does that shift the outlook of the energy mix moving forward?
Yes, and I think I'm a big believer in economics rules the day here. And so the policy setting can nudge that around, obviously. It's incentives, the sorts of mandates. So if we step back and look at that, the US, and this sort of varies around the world a little bit, the US has a very compelling opportunity in the near term with natural gas, just because it can be deployed. You're in this sudden increase in load and what can be deployed quite quickly. And so natural gas sounds great and it is quite compelling. The flip side to that is you can't actually buy a gas turbine in the US for the next 5 years. The full manufacturing capacity of GE, Siemens, all the usual players is actually already sold, right? I'm not saying they won't be able to ramp up more supply and all, but it's not just as easy as saying, hey, I want to build another natural gas plant. You can't buy one. And so in amongst that, I think gas will continue to get built at the fastest rate possible because, as it said, every bit of jet you can buy for it is being built. The ability to scale renewables is quite phenomenal as well. So just to distill that down, renewables will continue to be built at pace because their economics are compelling. Natural gas, particularly in the US, has a distinct opportunity for firming renewables, but also for just supplying this imminent shortfall of energy.
So, David, I wanted to ask about the AI boom, which is driving data center expansion. How is Energy Exemplar adjusting its tools or its models to reflect this fast-growing load?
Yes, and so the way we look at it doesn't really need us to change our tools per se. We've got a very flexible platform that enables us to look at any technology and mix, but it is changing the way we look at the future demand forecast. And it's actually an interesting one to forecast as you look at the scenarios of just how many data centers will be built. And we're in the middle of a hype cycle at the minute. And if anyone who's been around through a few of the technology booms knows that these are difficult to forecast. How much will AI dominate the future? How many data centers will need to be built to do that? Or will the models get more efficient? As we saw, when DeepSeek came out earlier this year, all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, maybe you don't need quite as much energy to get a good inference from an AI model. But I think regardless of those, AI is real, it's huge, it's going to have a material impact. So the way that we handle that and help our clients think about that is building more scenarios. So you build a range of what ifs, and you can do that. What if data center adoption's extremely high, medium high, or and you go through those and you see what happens with that. And for a lot of our clients, they're trying to understand that uncertainty and at what point you need to make a different decision and what the impact of each of those would be. And we've been actually addressing this issue this challenge for quite a few years, because even as you think about increasing renewable future, this future becomes more statistical. It's less certain about which asset will be running wherever, and it becomes about building up these statistical outlooks at the future and then understanding how portfolios perform under that. And I think AI is just another piece of that, or the data center load, because it's also true about other loads. How fast will EV adoption be? Will the electrification of heavy transportation, what rate will that happen? Industry switchovers. And so when you're in the energy sector, you're always looking at this substitution that happens. And we've seen it happen over many years as wood moved to oil, and then oil moved to coal, and then a lot of the oil load's been moving to gas, and now we've got renewables in the mix and nuclear and all these other pieces. So you're always evaluating that piece. The challenges outlaying here is that uncertain future and just how fast it'll ramp. So scenarios are the way you handle that. And we find that our clients are looking at an ever increasing number of scenarios now, and then positioning themselves to navigate through any of those. What do I do if X, Y, or Z happens?
Yeah, so I guess, David, expanding on that a little bit further, I was wondering, what are some of the modelling challenges that this shifting environment that we've been talking about has started to create?
There's some of the challenges, they sort of fall into several buckets. From the demand side, as we just discussed there, with AI being one of that. The supply side, so how fast will the supply technologies evolve and the costs of those, and then the ability to move energy as well, and then the regulatory overlay. And so I'll just sort of touch on that supply side piece. So we've seen some pretty radical shifts in supply over the last few years. You can think of it from the natural gas side, the advent of fracking reduced prices far more than, and made the availability of natural gas far greater than anyone suspected in the decades before that. In the same way that renewables have costed out far faster than anyone thought, and battery storage is now becoming a dominant player to fill the gap that peaking plants would have provided a few years ago. So those pieces are still playing out quite quickly, and you just never know where the next technological breakthrough will be. I think that keeps it super interesting. Then the other piece that's particularly relevant for the electricity side of it, and this plays into the natural gas piece in particular, is the transmission capacity. And so what we're seeing in a lot of markets now is that there's transmission bottlenecks. So just because you might even have energy somewhere, it doesn't mean you can get it to somewhere else, because that transmission system is full. And so a lot of the modeling now comes in of how much energy can you get through the system? What would it cost to augment that transmission network? Would it be more sensible to build either more generation, say that gas-fired, co-located with an asset? Would it be better to build batteries and try and use as much of that transmission capacity 24/7, but then using the batteries during the peak pieces? Those pieces of it are getting much more important and complicated. And so the people looking to develop projects are tackling a lot more of that side. And then you're looking into an uncertain regulatory future, trying to make decisions that can survive a another change into the future. And we've seen some pretty substantial projects get cancelled or changed or refactored in the last few months.
In light of that, David, what are some of your best practices when it comes to navigating these challenges, specifically when it relates to oil and gas?
Well, when it comes to oil and gas, what we've found increasingly, if you step back and look at the energy system, a few decades ago, you could have looked at one part of it and got a reasonable answer. And by what I mean by that is you could have looked at the gas network as an individual piece. You could have looked at the electricity network. You could have looked at transportation. And these days, that's no longer true. You actually need to look at all the pieces together to get the right answer. And you cannot understand natural gas markets without understanding electricity markets. And so this is one of the biggest changes that we've seen, is that people need to model all of that together. The supply constraints on the natural gas, the impacts of large gas generating power plant, on the electricity thing. So all of that. And so we've seen that evolution that now most large players model both of those concurrently. We call it sector coupling, right? And where you're looking at all these different supply chains together. And we see in the Middle East, they actually model the gas, electricity, water together, because water's such a huge load there, because they actually make all of their water through use of energy. And in Europe now, we see we support the OE and NSOG, so the European Transmission System Operators for Gas and Electricity, and they model electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen together to understand how those three networks will play. The oil's still a little on the side because it's not quite transport or network constrained, but that's where we see one of the big shifts. So modeling all of this together and then modeling a lot of scenarios and understanding. I sort of described this as people want to understand the topography. You want to understand where there's plains, where nothing much happens. You want to sort of understand the cliffs of despair, where, if you end up over there, you fall off and you're in a lot of trouble. And you want to understand the mountains of profit. And so then their job is to try and navigate their organizations to either put up fences so you can't fall off the cliff, and build highways, if you will, that get you to those mountains of more favorable conditions. And that's sounds so simple. It's actually a little more sophisticated than that. But the nice piece is, in conjunction with this rising complexity, we've also had the rise of cloud computing and all these things that allow us to make much more detailed representations of these networks in the world and go and solve these problems. So in some ways, there's this really nice companion thing happen, that as the AI and compute and all of these have gone forward, the complexity of the energy problems gone forward, we've been able to solve both of them hand in hand.
Right, David, a final question from me today. And I was just wondering if you could give us an idea on where you think the oil and gas industry's role in the data center ecosystem will be in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes, well, I still think there'll be a backup need, which, as discussed earlier, will be primarily delivered by oil in some form. I think natural gas generation is going to be a huge feature, particularly in North America for the foreseeable future. And then I think around the rest of the world, it's going to be much more localized around what generating assets are available in each of those localities. But particularly the gas side of the oil and gas will continue to play a big role in data centers for at least the next decade.
Great. David, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and expertise on this obviously fast-moving and fascinating area of the industry. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Callum. Really appreciate it.
So my thanks again to David for joining us for this episode of the Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast. As today's conversation has shown, data centers sit at the heart of our increasingly digital world, and the energy demands driving them are only set to grow. Oil and gas continues to play a vital role in meeting those needs, while low-carbon solutions and advanced modelling tools are helping the industry adapt to a changing landscape. Thanks for listening to this episode. Please remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
The Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast is brought to you by Owens Corning Foam Glass Insulation. From managing vapor drive and mitigating corrosion risk, to maintaining thermal performance and supporting safety on the job site, the insulating system plays a critical role in high-performing hydrocarbon processing facilities. Learn more about how foam glass insulation contributes to the design of high-performing insulating systems at cryogenic facilities at www.owenscorning.com/foamglasslng study. That's www.owenscorning.com/FOAMGLASLNG study.